January 1st, 1945, 9:15 in the morning. Across 16 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, men were nursing hangovers. The night before had been New Year's Eve. Champagne bottles still lay scattered near tents. Mechanics moved slowly. Pilots slept in. The war, for one quiet morning, seemed far away. Then the sky tore open. Over 1,000 German aircraft came in low and fast. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, wave after wave, screaming across frozen fields at treetop height. They hit the parked planes before anyone could scramble. Spitfires exploded on the tarmac. Typhoons burned in their dispersal areas. Thunderbolts disintegrated without ever leaving the ground. By 10 o'clock, 465 Allied aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. It was the single most devastating surprise attack on Allied air power since Pearl Harbor. And it destroyed the Luftwaffe. Not the enemy, the attack itself. Germany's Air Force did not lose this battle. It won, and that victory killed it. Because what happened over the next 90 minutes contained a secret that the German High Command never wanted the world to understand. The pilots who pulled off this impossible strike, the last experienced aviators the Reich still possessed, flew home into a slaughter they never saw coming. Not from the Allies, from their own guns. This is the story of Operation Bodenplatte, the mission that proved you can win every objective and still lose everything.
The question is how? How does an air force commit suicide by succeeding?
To understand that, you need to understand what the Luftwaffe had already become by the final winter of the war. By late 1944, the German Air Force existed mostly on paper. The numbers still looked impressive. Thousands of aircraft, dozens of fighter wings, hundreds of operational bases. But the numbers lied. Fuel was rationed so severely that new pilots received as little as 10 hours of flight training before being sent into combat. Veteran pilots were exhausted, flying sortie after sortie with no rotation, no rest, no relief. The factories still produced planes, but the men who could fly them were dying faster than they could be replaced. This was not a temporary crisis. It was a death spiral. Every month, the ratio of experienced pilots to novices grew worse. Every month, the kill rates against Allied bombers dropped. Every month, the Luftwaffe bled more expertise than it gained. By December 1944, the German Air Force had perhaps 300 truly elite pilots left. Men with 100 kills or more. Men who had survived since 1939. Men who knew their machines so completely that combat was instinct, not calculation. These pilots were irreplaceable. It would take years to train more. Years Germany did not have. Their survival was more important than any single mission. Losing them meant losing the war in the air. And then came the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West. 300,000 troops, nearly 2,000 tanks, everything the Wehrmacht could still scrape together, all thrown into a desperate gamble through the snow-covered forests of Belgium. The goal was to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. The offensive was called Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. The Allies would call it the Battle of the Bulge. For the first few days, it worked. American lines buckled. Entire divisions were surrounded. German armor pushed deeper than anyone thought possible. But there was a problem. The Luftwaffe could not protect the advance. Allied fighter bombers owned the skies. Every time the clouds parted, thunderbolts and typhoons ripped into German columns. Tanks burned, supply trucks exploded, fuel depots, already critically short, went up in flames. If the Wehrmacht's ground offensive was to have any chance at all, something had to be done about Allied air superiority. Quickly, decisively, catastrophically. And so, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring approved the most audacious air operation Germany had attempted since the Battle of Britain. Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate. The plan was simple in concept and staggering in ambition. Every operational fighter the Luftwaffe could muster, over 1,000 aircraft from 34 different units, would launch a coordinated surprise attack on Allied airfields at dawn on New Year's Day. They would catch the enemy on the ground, hungover and unprepared. They would destroy hundreds of planes in a single morning. They would, in one stroke, give the Wehrmacht the breathing room it needed to win in the Ardennes. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and the first ingredient of that catastrophe was secrecy. The attack had to be secret, completely, obsessively secret. If the Allies had any warning, even an hour, they could scramble their fighters, and the entire operation would become a slaughter in reverse. So the Luftwaffe command made a fateful decision. They did not inform the Wehrmacht's anti-aircraft batteries. The reasoning was cold but logical. The more people who knew, the greater the chance of a leak. The flak gunners didn't need to know. They would simply hold fire during the attack window, or so the planners assumed. But the orders never went out clearly. Communication between the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht was already poor. Bureaucratic jealousy, competing commands, the chaos of a collapsing front. All of it meant that when over 1,000 German aircraft flew west at dawn, the German soldiers on the ground had no idea who they were. They saw low-flying aircraft. They saw the distinctive silhouettes of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. But in the fog of war, in the tension of an ongoing offensive, with Allied fighter bombers hunting them daily, they did what they were trained to do. They opened fire. But that disaster was still hours away. At 4 a.m. on January 1st, 1945, the pilots of Bodenplatte were waking in frozen barracks across western Germany. They were a strange mix. Some were aces, men like Hauptmann Georg Peter Eder, who had over 70 kills and had survived being shot down 17 times. Men like Oberleutnant Theo Niebel, commander of the 2nd Group of Fighter Wing 53, a veteran of countless dogfights over the Reich. These men knew exactly how desperate this mission was. They knew the odds. They went anyway. Others were boys, 18 years old, with barely enough flight hours to take off safely. They had been pushed through training so fast that some had never fired their guns in the air. For them, Bodenplatte would be their first real combat mission. And for many, their last. The briefings were tense. Targets were assigned. Routes were drilled. Each strike force was given precise coordinates for its designated airfield: Eindhoven, Brussels-Evere, Maldegem, Sint-Denis-Westrum, Metz, Asch. 16 bases in total, 16 simultaneous attacks. The secrecy was so extreme that pilots were not told their targets until hours before takeoff. Maps were handed out and collected again. Nothing could be written down. Nothing could be leaked. At 07:20, the first engines coughed to life. The sky that morning was gray and frozen, with low clouds and patches of fog, perfect conditions for a surprise attack. The German formations flew west at treetop level, beneath Allied radar coverage, skimming over hedgerows and frozen streams. It was the kind of flying that required total concentration, total precision. One mistake at 200 feet meant death. Navigating was difficult. Many of the younger pilots had never flown this route. Landmarks were hard to see. Units became separated. Some formations arrived at their targets late. Others hit the wrong airfield entirely. But enough of them got through. At 9:15, the first bombs fell on Eindhoven. The effect was total devastation. Allied airfields in the winter of 44-45 were cramped, crowded, and utterly unprepared for a ground-level attack. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip. Fuel trucks sat beside ammunition dumps. Tents and buildings offered no protection. The German pilots came in strafing. Cannon fire ripped across the tarmac. Spitfires exploded in chains as burning fuel spread from one aircraft to the next. Ground crews scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to go. The attacks lasted only minutes, but in those minutes, entire squadrons ceased to exist. At Eindhoven alone, the Germans destroyed over 70 aircraft. At Brussels-Evere, nearly 50. At Melsbroek, another 40. Across all 16 bases, the toll was staggering. 465 Allied aircraft destroyed or damaged. Dozens of pilots killed on the ground. Hangars burning. Runways cratered. Air traffic control facilities shattered. By any tactical measure, Operation Bodenplatte was a spectacular success. And then the German pilots turned for home. This is where the victory became a death sentence. The return flight should have been simple. Same route, same altitude, same formation discipline. But nothing about this morning was simple. First came the Allied fighters that had managed to scramble. Not many. Most were caught on the ground. But enough. Squadrons from bases that hadn't been targeted. Pilots who took off anyway into the chaos. They found the retreating German formations and tore into them. The young Luftwaffe pilots, already exhausted from the stress of the attack, were no match for hardened Allied veterans. Dogfights erupted across the frozen countryside. German planes fell burning into Dutch farmland, into Belgian forests, into the rivers of the Ardennes. But the enemy killed fewer than half the returning aircraft that went down. The rest were killed by Germany itself. The Wehrmacht's anti-aircraft gunners had not been warned. They saw aircraft. They saw the black crosses. But they saw them coming from the wrong direction. From the west, not the east. They saw them flying low and fast, exactly the way enemy ground attack aircraft flew. They saw them over German-held territory, where Allied planes had been hunting them for months. And they fired. 88mm flak guns opened up. 20mm cannons ripped into formations. Machine guns laced the sky with tracer fire. German pilots who had just completed the most successful Luftwaffe mission in 2 years were shredded by German shells. Some tried to waggle their wings, the universal signal for friendly aircraft. It did not help. The gunners kept firing. Some pilots tried to dive away to escape the kill zone. They flew into terrain or were caught by the next battery. Others made it through the flak only to run out of fuel. The mission had stretched their range to the limit. Many aircraft came down in fields and forests, their pilots walking away, or not. By noon, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. The Luftwaffe had destroyed 465 Allied aircraft, but it had lost 271 of its own planes. Nearly 26% of the attacking force gone. That was bad, but it was not the catastrophe. The catastrophe was who had died. Of the 271 aircraft lost, many had carried the Luftwaffe's last experienced pilots, the aces, the veterans, the men who could not be replaced. 143 pilots killed or captured, dozens more wounded. Among the dead were commanding officers who had led fighter wings since 1940, men who had trained the younger pilots, men who knew the aircraft, knew the enemy, knew how to survive. 19 formation leaders, 3 wing commanders, the leadership corps of nearly a third of Germany's fighter units, destroyed in a single morning. The Allies took stock of their losses. They sent urgent requests back to England and America. Within 2 weeks, 14 days, every destroyed aircraft had been replaced. The production lines of Detroit and Birmingham could absorb losses like this without blinking. Germany could not. The factories were still running. The airframes were still being built. But there were no pilots to fly them. The instructors were dead. The squadrons were gutted. The doctrine and experience that held the Luftwaffe together had been shot out of the sky over Belgium. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe launched no more major offensive operations in the West. There was simply nothing left to launch them with. The Battle of the Bulge ground on for 3 more weeks, but without air cover, the Wehrmacht's advance crumbled. The Allies regrouped. The tanks ran out of fuel. The snow turned to mud. By late January, the Germans were in full retreat, and the war was decided. And in the airfields of Western Germany, young pilots with 20 hours of training tried to learn how to fight in machines they barely understood, led by officers who had no experience, supported by ground crews who were running out of parts. The Luftwaffe did not fall in a single dramatic defeat. It bled out slowly across the final months of the war, but the fatal wound was Bodenplatte. There is a grim mathematics to what happened that New Year's morning. The Allies lost more planes. That is true. 465 to 271. In a raw count, Germany won. But war is not a raw count. The Allies could replace their aircraft in 2 weeks, could replace their pilots in months, could train new ground crews, build new hangars, pave new runways. Germany could do none of those things. Every Focke-Wulf burned in Belgium was a machine that could never fly again. Every pilot killed or captured was a man whose skills died with him. Every commander lost was a decision-making center that could not be rebuilt. Bodenplatte destroyed the Luftwaffe's capacity to regenerate. It did not merely cost Germany 271 planes. It cost Germany the ability to ever build an effective air force again. The units that survived existed only on paper. The pilots who remained were increasingly desperate, increasingly undertrained, increasingly alone in skies ruled by Allied swarms. By April, when American and Soviet forces were closing on Berlin, the Luftwaffe was reduced to occasional sorties by individual aircraft. The great formations were gone. The coordinated attacks were impossible. The air belonged to the enemy, absolutely and permanently. The irony is almost unbearable. Bodenplatte was conceived as a way to save the Ardennes offensive, to give the Wehrmacht one more chance. Instead, it accomplished nothing in the Ardennes. The ground attack failed anyway, while destroying the one asset Germany could not afford to lose. The experienced pilots who died over Belgium that morning were worth more than 1,000 burning Spitfires. They represented years of institutional knowledge, years of hard-won skill, years of survival in the deadliest skies on Earth. And they were traded for an afternoon's worth of burning wreckage that was replaced before the month was out. The German commanders who planned Bodenplatte understood the risk. Some of them argued against it. But by January 1945, Germany was beyond rational planning. The orders came from above, from Göring, who needed a victory to save his reputation, and from Hitler, who demanded aggressive action, regardless of the cost. The pilots protested nothing. They followed their orders. Many of them knew, in the quiet moments before takeoff, that they would not come back. Some wrote letters. Others said nothing at all. The mission was a success. The mission was a catastrophe. Both things were true at the same moment. And the greatest catastrophe of all, the one that sealed the Luftwaffe's fate, was not caused by the enemy. It was caused by German flak gunners who had not been told their own aircraft were coming home. The secrecy that was supposed to protect Operation Bodenplatte became the weapon that killed it. The same obsessive precautions that kept the Allies unaware also kept the Wehrmacht in the dark. And when over 1,000 German aircraft flew west and then turned back east, the men on the ground did exactly what they had been trained to do. They fired at aircraft flying low over German positions. They fired at silhouettes that looked like enemy planes. They fired, and they kept firing, until the sky was full of falling wreckage. Nobody knows exactly how many German pilots were killed by their own anti-aircraft batteries that morning. The records are fragmentary. The chaos was total. Estimates range from 30 to 60 aircraft, possibly more. Somewhere between 50 and 100 pilots may have died to German guns. But even if the true number is at the low end, it represents a catastrophic failure of coordination. These were not accidents. They were systemic. They were the result of a command structure so fractured, so secretive, so suspicious that the left hand could not be trusted to know what the right hand was doing. This was the Luftwaffe in January 1945. This was the Third Reich in its final months, an empire tearing itself apart from the inside while still trying to project strength outward. There is one more detail that captures the tragedy of Bodenplatte better than any statistic. Among the pilots who did not return was a young officer named Walter Krupinski. He was not dead. He would survive the war and eventually become a general in the post-war West German Bundeswehr. But on the morning of January 1st, his aircraft was hit by German flak, and he barely made it back to friendly lines. Krupinski had 197 confirmed kills. He was one of the finest fighter pilots in the world, and he was shot down by his own country's guns while trying to complete a mission his own country had ordered. There is no better symbol of what Bodenplatte truly was. After the war, Allied analysts studied Operation Bodenplatte with a mix of respect and disbelief. They had been caught completely off guard. Their intelligence had failed. Their airfield security had been negligent. If the Germans had been able to repeat the attack, even once, the consequences might have been severe. But the Germans could not repeat it. They had spent everything on a single roll of the dice, and what they won was ashes. The Spitfires and Thunderbolts were rebuilt. The pilots were retrained. The hangars were repaired. The Luftwaffe's aces were buried in unmarked graves across Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. Their names faded from memory. Their skills, their experience, their irreplaceable knowledge, all of it gone. Today, Operation Bodenplatte is a footnote in most histories of World War II. A curious episode, a dramatic story, a what-if scenario for alternate history enthusiasts. But for those who understand air power, it is something far more significant. It is proof that tactics without strategy is suicide, that short-term gains can mask fatal losses, that an army can win every battle and still lose the war. And it is a reminder that in war, the most dangerous enemy is sometimes not across the lines. Sometimes it is the command structure above you, the secrecy that protects you, the system that sends you into battle without telling anyone you are coming. The Luftwaffe did not die over Berlin or Dresden, or in the great bombing raids over the Reich. It died on a frozen morning in January, when 1,000 German aircraft flew west into a brilliant tactical victory and flew back east into the guns of their own army. That was the last 1,000 planes. That was the last great attack. That was the day Germany's Air Force destroyed its own future and won every single objective while doing it. If this was the first time you've heard the full story of Operation Bodenplatte, you are not alone. This is one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes of the air war, and it deserves to be remembered, not as a victory or a defeat, but as a warning. If you want more stories like this, the hidden moments, the forgotten operations, the decisions that changed history, consider subscribing. There are battles that shaped the modern world that almost nobody talks about. This channel exists to find them, to tell them properly, and to make sure they are not lost. Some stories are too important to forget.